Okay, we just wait for Carola coming back home in order for her to attend. By the way, I just remind the online people that after the talk, if they want to ask a question, they just have to write question or Q in the chat. And we will take note of the order of the questions. Yes, just like that.
It'd be pretty good if you had a question already, but I haven't even said anything yet.
There will be many.
Yeah, we'll see.
So because I'm not sure whether I can manage, since I'm short-sighted, whether I can manage to see the raise hand icon from here. So if people write Q in the chat, it's better.
Yes.
Right. Okay, I think that I can start with welcoming the people that are either in presence or online. Welcome back to our Mumble seminar series. This is our third meeting this year, I guess. And we are very happy of having, at least virtually with us, Laura Gow from the University of Liverpool, UK. Laura is lecturing there in Liverpool, and she basically teaches philosophy of mind, but not only philosophy of mind, also metaphysics and other similar topics. And Laura has recently published a series of very interesting papers that are very related with our research programs here in Turin, which basically are one national project on the venerable issue of the mark of the mental, and a second project concerning the relationship between low-level and high-level perception and perception and cognition divide. And the last papers that Laura published are very much related with both programs, for she published in 2021 3 papers. One is Beyond Adverbialism, a new non-relational theory of perceptual experience that came out on Mind and Language. Another one which really struck us and attracted our interest, which is Empty Space, Silence and Absence, that came out on the Canadian Journal of Philosophy. And third, this one is related to the intentionality issue, intentionality as intentional in dash existence, that came out on Inquiry on the same year. Today, Laura is giving us a talk on philosophy of mind and perception, whose title is Necessary Veridically Hallucinations, a New Problem for the Uninstantiated Property View. Laura, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And again, I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. One day I will be there in person, I very much hope. And thanks to everyone for coming along to hear this talk. So let me just, there we are. Okay, so now we're all having this experience of, well, a picture of a green apple. And, you know, it seems we're aware of something green and so on. Now, if we imagine that we're actually hallucinating this green apple. So imagine that this is a hallucination and you're hallucinating a green apple, then the uninstantiated property view of hallucination says that what's going on here is that you're still aware of greenness, but you're aware of uninstantiated green. So hallucinations are just the awareness of uninstantiated properties. So you're aware of greenness, roundness, shininess, even though those properties aren't actually instantiated by anything in your environment. And my aim in this talk is to argue that proponents of the uninstantiated property view have to classify many hallucinatory experiences as veridical. That is my main claim. And I want to say, and that's kind of weird if you have to do that. So I'll look at the option of sort of biting the bullet later on when I discuss objections, but this is my argument that it's just strange if you have a view where you have to classify many hallucinations as veridical experiences. So I'm going to argue that proponents of the uninstantiated property view are actually in that bizarre position. Okay, so here's the plan for the talk. So first of all, I'm going to describe and motivate the uninstantiated property view, because I actually think it has a lot going for it. It has a lot in its favour. So first I want to motivate it. And also, it's more interesting to argue against a view that has a lot going for it. So I want to kind of start off by motivating that view. Then I'm going to run through some initial worries and say that they're not conclusive and that proponents are quite happy to just accept these problems. But then I want to move on to my own objection, which I'm going to argue is much more serious. And that's to do with having to classify certain hallucinations as veridical. In order to show that, first of all, I describe a kind of hallucinatory experience that proponents of the uninstantiated property view can classify as non-veridical. So I'm going to first describe a hallucination that's not problematic for the uninstantiated property view. And that's sort of by way of contrast to contrast it with this other experience, this other kind of hallucination that is going to be problematic. So then I describe as hallucinatory experiences which turn out to be veridical on the uninstantiated property view. And in the last part of the talk, I consider how proponents of the uninstantiated property view can respond to my argument and why their responses are unsatisfactory. So that's the plan. So let's start off with the uninstantiated property view. So this is just the view that hallucinations are the awareness of uninstantiated properties. Now this is a quote from Fred Dretske. Hallucinations are experiences in which one is aware of properties, shapes, colours, movements, etc., without being O-conscious, object conscious, of objects having these properties. Hallucinating about pumpkins is not to be understood as an awareness of orange pumpkin-shaped objects. It's rather to be understood as P-awareness, so property awareness of the kind of properties that O-awareness of pumpkins is usually accompanied by. Awareness, i.e. P-awareness, of properties without awareness, O-awareness, of objects having these properties may still strike some readers as bizarre. Can we really be aware of uninstantiated universals? Yes, we can, and yes, we sometimes are. So this is just to illustrate, that Fred Dretske holds this view that if you're hallucinating a pumpkin, you're not aware of an object instantiating orange and smoothness, for example, but you're still aware of those properties. Here are 3 quotes from Michael Tye, who also endorses this view. Along with most other representationalists, I'm happy to say that in the hallucinatory case, the perceiver is conscious of an uninstantiated property. In the case of hallucinations, the only features of which we're aware and to which we can attend are locally uninstantiated features of a sort that, if they belong to anything, belong to external particulars. He carries on, you cannot attend to what is not there. But on my view, there is an uninstantiated quality there in the bad cases. An uninstantiated quality is present in hallucination. So that's to hopefully get clear on the view. Here are some other people who also endorse this view. So it's a pretty popular view of hallucination, really. And even though, as Dretske says, it might seem strange to think you can be aware of uninstantiated universals, I think the view has a lot going for it. Everyone will be familiar with this quote, but I'll read it out in in any case. And this one motivation for the view is to explain how it captures the phenomenal character of our experiences. So, as Price says, when I see a tomato, there's much that I can doubt. I can doubt whether it's a tomato I'm seeing or a cleverly painted piece of wax. I can doubt whether there's any material thing there at all. Perhaps what I took for a tomato was really a reflection. Perhaps I'm even the victim of a hallucination. One thing, however, I cannot doubt, that there exists a red patch of a round and somewhat bulgy shape standing out from a background of other colour patches and having a certain visual depth, and that this whole field of colour is directly present to my consciousness. So the idea here is that if you're hallucinating a red tomato, you can doubt whether there's a tomato there, but you can't doubt that you're aware of redness. You know, you can't doubt that you're aware of redness and aware of roundness and of shininess and what have you. And this is to say that how can we explain the phenomenal character of our hallucinations if we don't appeal to uninstantiated properties? So what explains the phenomenal character if it's not the awareness of those properties? So the proponent of the uninstantiated property view will say, why is it that you seem to be experiencing, why is redness involved in your experience if you're not aware of red? And so their view, they can say, it may seem a little strange to start with, but it very easily explains the phenomenal character of your experience, why your experience seems to be involving red, because you're aware of uninstantiated red. So that's the first motivation. The second one is that it explains how we can come to have certain kinds of knowledge if we endorse the uninstantiated property view. So you'll all be familiar with Mary, who grew up in a black and white room and has never seen colours at all. Now, a couple of people, I think Mark Johnston and Adam Pout, have pointed out that Mary could come to know what it's like to see red simply by hallucinating red. So even though she's never seen instantiated red before, she could come to know what it's like to see red just by having a hallucination of red. And so the proponent of the uninstantiated property view will say, well, the explanation for that is because she's aware of red. She's aware of uninstantiated red, the property red, and that's how she knows what it's like to see red. Relatedly, we can also learn that red is more similar to orange than it is to green by hallucinating these colours. So if Mary was to hallucinate red, orange, and green, she could learn just from her hallucination that red is more similar to orange. So the uninstantiated property person will say, look, how could hallucinatory experiences provide us with knowledge if hallucinations don't involve the awareness of colour and other properties? So if we're not aware of redness and orange in our experience, how can we know that they're similar? And actually, so anybody who thinks that when you hallucinate red, you're aware of red, anyone who thinks that is a proponent of the uninstantiated property view, and yeah, the target of this talk, I guess. So like I've said, there's some good things in its favour, some really good things. It does a good job of explaining phenomenal character, and it explains how we can learn certain things just through having hallucinations. And it does that by saying, look, we really are aware of the property red if we hallucinate a red tomato, and that's how we can know things about red and why our experience involves redness. Okay, so I've motivated the view, hopefully. Now I'll discuss some just initial problems. The first is that it's counterintuitive. Like Dretske said, it seems a bit strange to think that we can be aware of uninstantiated properties. We're usually only aware of properties by being aware of objects instantiating those properties. I don't think we should rest a lot on this objection, since lots of stuff in philosophy is counterintuitive, and it's not really a good objection to a view. If the only thing about it is that it's counterintuitive, that's not enough for rejecting it. And actually, proponents of this view will say, yes, it's counterintuitive, but it has these theoretical explanatory virtues, the ones that I've just explained. The other problem will be its metaphysical commitments. So of course, we're going to have relations to abstracta on this view. There are people, Uri Kriegel, David Papineau in particular, who have said that our current conscious mental states, so concrete things, shouldn't be dependent upon abstracta. So you might think that even if you don't mind abstract entities in general, having our sort of concrete current mental states depend upon abstracta is going too far. And this is coming from Susanna Schellenberg. If you're a physicalist, then having non-physical entities playing an essential role in our experiences seems to be a problem. So if you're a physicalist, you might not, there might be a reason to back away from this view. However, as you'll know, Dretske and Tai are physicalists, and so these are, these metaphysical commitments are things that people are happy to bite the bullet on and to say that they're fine. So these initial problems are acknowledged by the proponents of the view and are not thought sufficient for rejecting it. Okay, so now I want to get on to my objection against the view, and it starts off by claiming that we all want to, whether we're representationalists or naive realists, the two kind of main views of perception around at the moment, we're going to want to make a distinction between veridical experiences and non-veridical experiences. And everybody does make this distinction. So for the representationalist, an experience is veridical if the content of the experience is true or accurate. And hallucinations and illusions are misperceptions. So the error involved arises at the level of experience through the content of that experience being false or inaccurate. So that's what veridicality and non-veridicality is for the representationalist. Now, for the naive realist relationalist, they still want to make use of the veridical, non-veridical distinction. They still think that's important. But on their view, our perceptual experiences are not representational, and only the beliefs we make as a result of our experiences can be assessed for error. Non-veridical experiences are those which lead to inaccurate or false beliefs about the way the world is, and so the error involved arises at the level of belief. So both of these main views of perception have the veridical, non-veridical distinction, even though they explain it in different ways. So for the representationalist, it's done at the level of the experience, with the content being true or false. For the naive realist, technically speaking, the experiences themselves aren't, true or false because they're not representational. But it's the beliefs, non-veridical experiences are the ones that lead to false beliefs, and veridical experiences are the ones that lead to true beliefs. So both accounts are making use of that veridicality notion. Okay, so going forwards now, if we still want to say that some experiences are veridical and some aren't veridical, this is where the problem gets going. So to start with, like I said, I'm going to describe some hallucinations that aren't a problem for the uninstantiated property view. So these are hallucinations that they are able to classify as hallucinations, okay? So remember our apple experience from the beginning that we were imagining was a hallucination. So if it seems to you that you're hallucinating a green apple, then we seem to be standing in an awareness relation to green, and we really are on the uninstantiated property view. But the green seems to be instantiated by an object in our local, publicly accessible environment. And of course it isn't. There's no apple. So the content of our experience and the content of the perceptual belief is false, and the experience is non-veridical. So in those cases where you seem to be hallucinating an object, so you're hallucinating an actual green apple, these are experiences that the uninstantiated property view can classify as non-veridical, because your experience says not just that there's green, that you're aware of green, but that you're aware of a green apple, and that's false. You're not aware of a green apple. The green isn't instantiated, and so your experience is non-veridical. So the uninstantiated property view can explain why those hallucinations are non-veridical. So now I want to consider a class of hallucinations that I'm going to call property hallucinations, and I'm going to argue that these hallucinations are problematic for the uninstantiated property view. So the first example of a property hallucination is an after image. So if you like, you can stare at this red rectangle while I'm talking for a bit. and you'll probably have an after image experience when you look away. So I think after images are examples of these property hallucinations, and my claim is going to be that after image experiences seem to involve the awareness of uninstantiated properties. Okay, so I'm going to argue that the best way of capturing the phenomenology, what it's like to experience an after image, is that it seems to be the awareness of uninstantiated properties. Okay, so but there's a challenge to that idea that I have to overcome first before I get to what the actual problem is. For the uninstantiated property view, there's a challenge to how I want to characterize these property hallucinations. So I want to say, it seems to you that you're aware of, after images seem to be the awareness of uninstantiated properties. Now, Michael Tye has argued something a bit different. He says, experiencing a red after image on a yellow background is similar, perhaps, to that of viewing in dim lighting a blood stain on a transparent sheet of glass suspended between oneself and a yellow background surface. Even when we know it's an after image, one's experience is still phenomenally similar to the veridical experience of the blood stain. So basically, he's saying, actually, after images seem to be instantiated, okay? And I want to say that after images seem to be uninstantiated. So that's what the argument is about. So the challenge, it's been argued by Michael Tye that after images should be characterized as seeming to involve an awareness of instantiated properties. So Tye argues that after images have the same phenomenal character as some ordinary perceptual experiences of instantiated properties, like I've just described, the blood stain on the piece of glass. So Tye argues that they seem to be instantiated, and Ian Phillips has a paper too defending this idea that after images seem to be instantiated as light phenomena, he argues. Now, if they're right, if it's true that after images seem to be instantiated, then my opponent can justify classifying after image experience as non-veridical, because they'll say, look, you have this after image experience, it seems to you that you're aware of an instantiated property, it's not instantiated, and that's why the experience is non-veridical. Okay, and that would be a problem for me, because I need to claim that it seems to you that the property is uninstantiated. Okay, so this is how I'd like to respond to the challenge. Firstly, I would agree that for a moment, after images can seem to be instantiated by an object in the local environment, but not for long. So I think Tye and Phillips are wrong. And that's because after images have many unusual features. So they move with the direction of our gaze, their vividness diminishes over a relatively short period of time, they're not occludable, and they don't exhibit size constancy. Okay, so I don't think we experience after images as being instantiated. I think I'm right. I think they do seem to be the awareness of uninstantiated properties. Now, why is it, I ask, why do Tye and Phillips want to claim that we experience after images as instantiated properties? Because it seems, I think, that we don't. It seems evident from our experience that we're not experiencing after images as being instantiated. So why do they want to deny this? Why do they want to say that after images seem to be instantiated? And I think if we understand this, their motivations, we can actually just dispel the challenge. And so this is a quick digression, I guess, to explain, to sort of get rid of this challenge to my argument. So Tye and Phillips want to defend transparency against the qualia theorists. So quick definition of that. So transparency is the idea that everything in perception seems to be external and mind independent. And the qualia theorist says that perception also includes an awareness of internal mind-dependent features, and they use after images as prime examples of this. Now, Tye and Phillips want to refute the qualia theorists' claim that after images seem to be internal by arguing that they seem to be external. And they defend the claim that after images seem external by arguing that they seem to be instantiated by mind-independent objects. So basically, Tye and Phillips, their main motivation, the reason they say after images seem to be instantiated is because they want to reject the qualia theorist's idea. They want to reject the idea that they seem to be internal. And so the way they go about rejecting that idea is by saying, no, look, they seem to be instantiated. However, this is a false dilemma. We can deny that after images seem to be internal, so we can reject the qualia theorist, without claiming that they seem to be instantiated by external objects. So Tighe and Phillips, I think, can just agree with my characterization. After images seem to be uninstantiated properties. So in other words, I'd say Tighe and Phillips, their motivation is to simply reject the qualia theorist's view. So they don't want to say that after images seem internal, but they go too far. In trying to reject that idea, they go so far as to saying that they seem to be instantiated externally. Now, I think they would be happy, or should be happy, to say, yes, the qualia theorist is wrong. They don't seem to be internal. After images seem to be uninstantiated properties. So they seem to be not internal, but they don't seem to be instantiated. They seem to be an awareness of uninstantiated properties. So in other words, I think if we hadn't been misled by this false dilemma that Tighe and Phillips seem to think exists, they could be happy with my own view that after images seem to be uninstantiated properties. Now I've introduced the qualia theorists. They obviously would dispute my characterization of after images too. So I want to say that they seem to be uninstantiated properties, and the qualia theorists want to say that they seem to be internally realized. Again, I think the qualia theorists are just wrong to say that after images seem to be internal experiential properties. I know that's not really an argument, it's just an assertion of my thinking that they're wrong, but still. I'd say that emotions and moods probably seem to be internal. Emotions and moods seem to be, I don't know, instantiated by ourselves internally in some respect. But I think colour properties and shape properties can't seem to be internal. I don't think they can seem to be instantiated by oneself or by one's mind. Now, notice I'm not saying anything about the metaphysics of colour properties or shape properties here. We're just talking about the phenomenology, and I don't think that colours can seem to be internally realised. Even if you think they are, even if you think it's just the brain, doing the whole experience, it can't seem that way to you. It can't seem that the colour property is internally realised. Now, qualia theorists motivate their view that after images do seem to be internal by saying that after images seem to be mind dependent. So they say, look, after images seem to be mind dependent, and therefore they must seem to be internally realised. But there are two ways of understanding mind dependent. You could understand it in this way, that they seem metaphysically dependent on the mind, and I would deny that. I don't think after images seem to be metaphysically dependent on the mind. Or you could understand mind dependent as controlled by the mind. So kind of like telekinesis. And I think that's how after images seem to be related to the mind. I think they seem to be uninstantiated properties that somehow are controlled by your mind. So they move, after images move when you move, and so on. Anyway, so the conclusion of this is that I've argued that the phenomenology of after-image experience is best characterized as seeming to be aware of uninstantiated properties. So I've argued against the qualia view that they seem to be internal, and I've argued against Tighe and Phillips' claim that they seem to be instantiated. I say that the phenomenology of after-image experience is best characterized as us seeming to be aware of uninstantiated properties. Now, here's the problem for the uninstantiated property view. So proponents of the uninstantiated property view claim that we really are aware of uninstantiated properties in after-image experience. So it doesn't just seem to you that you're standing in an awareness relation to uninstantiated green, say, you really are. And that would mean that the experience is perfectly veridical. And so this is my objection to the uninstantiated property view. It seems that you're aware of uninstantiated properties in an after-image, and on their view, you really are aware of uninstantiated properties. So the experience is veridical, and they would have to say those experiences are perfectly veridical. And I think that's a problem. So here's another example of a property hallucination, the famous waterfall illusion. And if you'd like to, you can stare at the moving water and look away while I'm talking. So this is another property hallucination, and I'd say the same thing as I said about after images. So we seem to be aware of movement when we participate in this hallucination. We seem to be aware of movement, but nothing seems to be moving. So if you stare at the waterfall for a long time and then look away at something stationary, the stationary object doesn't seem to be moving, but you still seem to be aware of movement. So we seem to be aware of movement, but nothing seems to be moving. In other words, we seem to be aware of uninstantiated movement. And for the uninstantiated property theorist, we really are. And so again, the uninstantiated property view is going to have to say that our experience is perfectly veridical. It seems to us we're aware of uninstantiated property of movement, and we really are. There's nothing wrong. The experience is veridical. Okay, so the conclusion to my my positive argument, I guess, against the view is that when the representation or content of an experience does not include a commitment to the local instantiation of experience properties, nor their presence in the local publicly accessible environment, the representationalist is unable to justify our classifying such experiences as non-veridical. Similarly, when our experience does not lead to the belief that the properties are locally instantiated, the naive realist is unable to justify our classifying these experiences as non-veridical. So in other words, whether you are a representationalist who believes in the uninstantiated property view, or whether you're a naive realist who believes in the uninstantiated property view, this is a problem, for both accounts. Neither the representationalist or the naive realist proponent of the uninstantiated property view can classify property hallucinations as being anything other than veridical. So that's the argument. Now, kind of nearing the end-ish, I suppose. Now I'm going to look at a couple of possible responses to this argument. The first way that my opponent could respond to the argument is to find something in the content, either of the experience, if you're a representationalist, or the perceptual belief, if you're a naive realist, which is false. So if my opponent can find something in the content that's false, then property hallucinations can be classified as non-veridical after all. The second response I'll look at is the biting the bullet response. So my opponent could simply embrace my conclusion, and they can say that the experiences I'm calling property hallucinations are in fact veridical. And so they shouldn't be thought of as illusions or hallucinations at all. So they can just say, you know what, you're right. When you see an after image, it seems to you you're aware of an uninstantiated property. You really are. So that experience turns out to be veridical. So they could say that. I'll look at these responses in turn now and say why I think they don't work. So the first one first. So the first response is to say that property hallucinations are non-veridical because the content of the experience is false. Now, I mean, there might be different ways of doing this, and I'll talk about one. The simplest way for my opponent to make this claim is to argue that an aspect of the content of the experience or perceptual belief is false. After images don't seem to be instantiated, nor do they seem to be in the local publicly accessible environment. So to that extent, the experience is veridical, but perhaps they seem to be spatially located. If after images do seem to be spatially located, then my opponent can say the uninstantiated properties we're aware of aren't really spatially located, and that's why the experience can qualify as being non-veridical. And there's another after image for you here that will help you to think about this potential response to my argument. Again, if you stare at it for a while and then look away, you'll get the effect. So, I'm claiming that after image experiences, they're best characterized as seeming to be aware of uninstantiated properties, and that's why the uninstantiated property view has to say they're veridical. But my opponent could say, yeah, sure, you're right about that. However, in an after image, the properties that you're experiencing, these birds against the background, they seem to be in spatial relations, but they're not really in spatial relations. And so that's why we can say that the experience is non-veridical after all. So this is why I think that that's not going to work. So first of all, after images, they don't seem to be genuinely spatially located. So it's not true that the after image seems to have a genuine spatial relation to like the objects that are actually there surrounding you. So my opponent can't say that they seem to be, I don't know, to the left of the door or something, because when you move, the after image moves. So they don't seem to be genuinely spatially located. So my opponent would have to say, okay, but if the after image experience is complex, so if you've got different properties going on, then the uninstantiated properties will seem to be spatially related to each other. So the birds in that, the bird shape after image will seem to be related to the other bird shaped after images. And so they seem to be spatially related to each other, and they're not really. But I don't think my opponent can deny that these spatial relations really obtain, because then it becomes unclear how appealing to, I should say my opponent can try to deny that these relations really obtain, but then it becomes unclear how appealing to uninstantiated properties is going to explain the phenomenal character of the experience. So if they say, you know, the different colors of your after image experience aren't really spatially related to each other, then we would ask, but the only reason you're appealing to uninstantiated properties is to explain the phenomenal character. And since we can learn that, you know, red, well, if they're not really related to each other at all, then it doesn't explain the phenomenal character. And also, if we can learn about red through hallucinating red, we can also learn from hallucinating, like, you know, red next to orange, we can also learn about the relation next to, can't we? And so if we run the same argument, then it seems we have to say that the relations are, I don't know, really obtain as well. So if we're going to use uninstantiated properties to explain phenomenal character and explain how we can learn stuff about the content from the content of a hallucination, since we can learn about red and orange, we can also learn about the relation next to. And so I don't think my opponent can deny that the after images really are spatially related in some sense, not genuinely, but in some sense. So I don't think that they can take that route. Even if this response can be made to work, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, it doesn't provide a false content for the simple after image experiences or for the waterfall illusion. So the simple property illusions where just one property is involved, these experiences will still turn out to be veridical on this view. So it would make the problem smaller, but it wouldn't make the problem go away. Okay, so last I'll look at the second option, the second possible response. And that's if my opponent just bites the bullet and says property hallucinations are veridical. Now, they could say this, and this is how I'd respond. So I'm assuming that if somebody does say this, then the uninstantiated property theorist won't want to say that after image experiences are entirely on a par with ordinary veridical experiences. So if they say that ordinary veridical experiences and property hallucinations, they're all veridical, I think they'll still want to make some distinction between them. They won't want to say they're entirely on a par. And there's an easy solution for them. We distinguish between veridical experiences in terms of the nature of the entities they're experiences of. So my opponent can still differentiate these different kinds of veridical experience on the basis of what we're experiencing. Now, there's a problem for the representationalist if they take this route. If they say, well, ordinary veridical experiences, you're aware of physical objects, and, you know, veridical property hallucinations, in those veridical experiences you're aware of abstracta, I think the view is going to collapse into disjunctivism, and that's not happy for the representationalist. The representationalist wants to be able to give the same kind of account for all experiences. I've got this other paper, which I won't go into the details now, of course, just explaining why the view collapses into disjunctivism. It's basically related to the transparency claim again. Representation lists appeal to transparency, and it's clear that they're appealing to like an essential relation to what the experience is of, to explain the phenomenal character. We can talk more about that in Q&A. But I think this is also going to be a problem for naive realists, that is distinguishing between these different veridical experiences based on the entities that they're of. Now, naive realists are disjunctivists already, of course, and they say that perceptual experiences count as genuinely perceptual because they essentially involve a relation to the mind-independent entities that they're of. And they say traditionally hallucinations don't qualify as genuinely perceptual. There's some other kind of mental state. So naive realists are already disjunctivists, but this is still going to be a big problem for their view. And that's because in the first place, naive realists who endorse this uninstantiated property view have this following problem. Hallucinations, illusions, and ordinary veridical experiences will all involve essential relations to mind-independent entities. So therefore, they should all count as perceptual experiences, and it'll turn out that they're the same kind of mental state. So the naive realist can no longer make this differentiation between experiences that, you know, involve a relation to a mind-independent object, because for the uninstantiated property proponent, all experiences involve a relation to mind-independent entities. And of course, you can make this distinction then about whether they involve a relation to abstracta or ordinary physical objects. But the naive realist probably won't want to do this, because it will mean that the veridical hallucinatory distinction will no longer be a metaphysical distinction. So it will no longer be the case that veridical and hallucinatory experiences map onto experiences which are relations to physical objects and experiences which are relations to abstracta, because if they're biting the bullet, then they're going to have to say that some veridical experiences are relations to abstracta. So they're going to have this disjunctivism within the category of veridical experience. Some veridical experiences are relations to ordinary physical objects, some are relations to abstracta. So their disjunctivism, which was pretty plausible seeming when it marked a metaphysical distinction, is no longer so, the metaphysical distinction no longer tracks their veridical versus hallucinatory distinction. Anyway, so I think that's going to be a problem for the naive realist. So either way of going, I don't think whether you're a representationalist or a naive realist proponent of uninstantiated properties, I don't think it's a good thing to sort of just bite the bullet. There's another problem with biting the bullet and saying that, some property hallucinations are veridical, and that's where the necessarily veridical hallucinations bit comes in. And this is the last slide. So it's always possible to wonder whether our perceptual experiences are accurate. And I've argued that the uninstantiated property theorist has to classify many non-veridical experiences as veridical. So it seems during an after-image experience that we're aware of uninstantiated properties, and we really are. That's what I've argued. It seems that we're aware of uninstantiated properties, and we really are. So they have to say the experience is veridical. However, on this, if we take this option, not only is our after-image experience veridical on this view, it's necessarily veridical. So the appeal to uninstantiated properties in the first place was to explain the phenomenal character of the experience. Now, if you could be wrong about which uninstantiated property you're aware of, it wouldn't explain the phenomenal character, and there'd be no reason to deposit them. So if when you're experiencing, you're hallucinating a green apple, and it turns out that you're really aware of the uninstantiated property red, although it seems that you're aware of the uninstantiated property green. That would make no sense because it no longer explains the phenomenal character. So my proponent will have to say that not only is your experience of that green apple hallucination, the after image, a green after image, not only is it veridical, it's necessarily veridical. Okay, so just in summary, I've described some experiences which I've called property hallucinations. I've argued that during these experiences, we seem to be aware of uninstantiated properties. I've argued that proponents of the uninstantiated property view are therefore going to have to classify these experiences as veridical. We seem to be aware of uninstantiated properties, and we really are. And in the last slide, I've explained that not only are these experiences veridical, they're necessarily veridical. The fact that these abstract involving experiences turn out to be more epistemically secure than ordinary perceptual experiences, I would argue, is problematic in itself, but a theory of hallucination which entails that some hallucinations are necessarily veridical verges on the absurd. And that's the end. Thank you so much for listening.